You're listening to the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast, the show with a light-hearted look at the eventing world, all of the big event previews, reviews, and special guests, and of course, backed up with all of the key Echo Ratings stats. Welcome to the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast. Welcome to the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast, and we have got, listeners, a Hall of Fame episode for you. And the next person to come on the show is somebody whose name has been bandied around from the very start. Catherine Austin is with me once again. Catherine, I am very much looking forward to hearing from this person. Legend, absolute legend.
I know that's a much overused word, but I think we can definitely use it this time. This person is undoubtedly the most famous event rider Britain has ever produced, and her legacy to the sport continues all the time through her teaching, her training, her passion for cross-country riding.
It really does. That was very well put. She is, of course, Lucinda Green, the only person to win badminton, a record 6 times on 6 different horses. I'm sure we'll talk about a few of those horses. It's just an absolutely remarkable achievement. Lucinda, thank you very much for coming on the show.
You two do flatter me. I'm so chuffed to be speaking to you both. Thank you. I must say, I find it rather an extraordinary time of my life, this, because people keep doing these sort of this is your life bits, and so far I've managed to cry every time, so I hope I don't do it to you.
Oh, I don't know. I might be disappointed if we don't make you cry now.
Well, I think I'm getting used to it now, so I might not.
Oh, well, we'll see. Lucinda, let's go back to the very beginning of your childhood. Tell us a bit about your childhood growing up and where the love of horses came from.
It's a really good question, and I think it was in the blood. Dad was brought up with horses, played a lot of polo up until the war, and Mum hunted. So I think horses was in their blood, but not in the crazy way it's become now. But it meant that they were quite happy for ponies to be a part of my growing up, but they would never let me have a pony until I'd learnt to ride. I think when I was 4, Lavender was produced, a little white bundle of fluff that I think an aunt had lent that was very old and potted around and didn't do very much. And then I said, love a pony. And she said, well, you can't have one, Mum. Said, until you've learnt to ride. And so we had the most brilliant local riding school belonging to Betty Skelton, who's a very, very well-known showing side saddle lady, a huge knowledge and very, very good at teaching. And I used to go there twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday, on the back of my nanny's bicycle. Got a long way. I mean, it's 3.5 miles. And then Mr. Plod came along and stopped us and said, it's not safe and you're not allowed on the back of a bicycle. So we had to take the bus 1:20 from the local spot in the village, and off we went. And anyhow, Mrs. Skelton was wonderful and taught me a lot about how to ride and look pretty, and lots of exercises on horses, flinging your legs around, doing all the things around the world. I'm sure you remember. Lots of no stirrups. It was a wonderful education, and she also gave me the opportunity to ride in some shows on the ponies that she'd bred, some at the beginning and the leading rein. And then I remember when I was 10, Richmond Royal Horse Show, I was on the 13-2 and riding free, without a leading rein or anything. And it was just one of the most exciting times of my life to be in that main arena, the Richmond Royal Horse Show. But I wasn't a showy. If I got to a show 2 or 3 times a year, that was brilliant. I wasn't like I was doing it every weekend in a professional sort of way. So that really brought me on to my 8-year-old Christmas present was Jupiter, a New Forest pony, who was bought for £125 from a local pony club family. And he was absolute gem, probably taught me two of the greatest lessons of my life by actually not being a particularly good pony. He didn't really enjoy jumping, didn't really enjoy going anywhere. He just was quite a lazy New Forest pony, but very, very sweet. And he had a brilliant method of taking off in front of a fence and landing in front of it, which would send me sailing straight over the fence without it. So he taught me, and it was duty special. We used to giggle about it, but it did teach me to sit jolly tight. And by sitting tight, I mean sitting late. And that's one of the hallmarks of my success, was really that I did get, after a huge amount of wonderful teaching from Pat Burgess, I did get a seat that could survive quite a lot. And he taught me, as well as that basic speech, he taught me 2 other amazing things that stood me in such good stead. And I really do think I could owe him my 6 badminton wins, as well as an awful lot of other wonderful people that helped me, because he taught me the timing of hitting a horse, because he didn't really want to jump. So I had to learn how to whack him with the stick, which, I mean, at my size, age 8, 9, 10, wasn't going to make much difference to him. But the actual urgency of the urging and the timing of doing it was something I've never managed to teach anybody else. And he taught me that timing. And the other thing he taught me was to have very, very soft hands on the landing of a fence, because if I touched his mouth over a fence, he certainly wouldn't jump the next one. He didn't really want to anyhow, but he certainly wouldn't if I touched his mouth. So I learned the huge thing of fingers that open and let the horse take whatever they need as they land over a fence. And it's only really in recent times I've realized that was probably the reason 6 such incredibly different horses, and some of them not that talented, were prepared to give their absolute all and go around badminton for me, because they never, ever felt that they were going to have their freedom, their head and neck, which is ultimately their 5th leg, interfered with. And that's because Duke, aged 8, had taught me that. So that was 125 quid very well spent.
Lucinda, why and how eventing? How did eventing come into your life?
Easy question to answer. My goodness, I thought I'd be a show jumper, because that was all the rage. So we used to go to the next pony was a little bit better, Irish Connemara thoroughbred called Seasway. And actually she was a very, very good pony indeed, but she came to me absolutely grass green. So we did spend quite some time with front legs one side of the fence and back legs the other. But then we did get going, and she took me some show jumping shows. I remember going to Newbury Agricultural Show, which is quite a reasonably big show even in those days. And we went in and we did our round. I can't remember what happened, came out, and it was all good fun. And then we listened as the others went in, and the children's terrors were so appalling to them. And there was so much of, why did you do that? And that wasn't any good. You rode that really badly. And I'd just come out, and Mum and Dad, and what happened in there, but we all thought it was great anyhow. And we loved it, and it was such fun. And then we suddenly realized that this wasn't fun, because the attitude of all those people that we were competing with was so, well, we thought it was awful, but it was certainly different. So then we went Pony Club eventing. We tried that. And that absolutely took me, because A, the people were lovely. Nobody really thought they were going to win. None of us knew if we'd even get round. And the thrill of cross country and of trying to persuade Seasway that it was okay to go from one side of a ditch to another. And it was just completely my métier. But then, of course, I had to struggle for the rest of my life with the thing that wasn't my métier, which was dressage.
What came next? How did you move on to horses?
Well, my legs were getting long, and Seasway was going to have to be sold, which was heartbreaking, because I'd had her for about 4 years. And we were looking in the horse and how we didn't know how you find a horse, but we knew we needed another one that was a bit bigger than Seasway. And there was quite a big, in those days, advertisement in the Horse and Hound. It was sort of a double column, and it said "Buy fair and square." And we're not really knowledgeable about eventing, but we did notice that the horse called Fair and Square had won Burley, and that was a pretty big event. So this horse must be amazing if he was by Fair and Square. We didn't stop to think that Fair and Square probably wasn't a stallion or anything like that, which he wasn't. But in fact, he had begat Be Fair in a yearling. He jumped over the fence into a thoroughbred mare's field as a yearling, and he was the father of Be Fair. Anyhow, we went up to see this horse. It was for sale. I remember the prices because they're so crazily different to now. For £525, and he was 5 years old. And he was at Hagley Hall in Warwickshire, near Birmingham, in a livery yard. And we got there, and this rather nice-looking chestnut, quite tall for me. He'd come off 14.2. He probably measured 16.1, but he had a big wither. And he looked very pretty and nice neck and everything, and nice big eye, and got on him. Didn't really notice any of this in those days. And there was no jumps. And I thought, well, I can't buy a horse without jumping him. The only thing I could find to jump was the posts and rails up the side of the drive that was the other side of a grass verge. So I just sort of pointed him at them. I mean, God, honestly, I can do it now. And he jumped them, and Mum saw my face and she said, "That we got to buy that horse. That smile on your face when that horse jumped those posts and rails." So we bought him, and at that point, my dad was bound up in containerizing British freight. At that point, we still flung freight in nets off cranes into the holds of ships, and containerization had happened in Australia. And he was bringing it back into England, but there he was away from us. He was the only one who had any proper knowledge of horses, having been in the military. And he came back from Australia a couple of weeks later. You might at least have bought a horse with 4 feet. This horse, who had been vetted, but he did have a split from a wire cut or something in his coronet band, which meant that his hoof never grew down. It certainly hasn't done then, and it never did. So he had a complete split in his foot. And it actually, apart from a little bit of trouble early on, it never did cause any problem. But he caused problems because he was a nightmare. He only really knew to stand up on his hind legs. That was his answer to everything. Never did it when I tried him. They never do. And so Mrs. Skelton took him on for me while I went back to school. And then some friends took him on because he wouldn't even go down the road without, rearing and spinning. And he was a little brat. And they had a lingerie out of the window of the Land Rover. They'd follow him down the road with one of them on him and one of them in the Land Rover. And they did an amazing job. They made it possible for me to have a bit of a summer with him in the pony club. But then the real turning point was when he went to Tom Payne in the Pytchley in Northamptonshire. And he hunted him and was brave enough the very first day he had him out hunting. He'd not even ridden him before. He didn't even know if the horse could jump. Hans went, and he had the alternative of turning around and going back out the gate, which any sensible young horse probably should do, or going straight to the corner of the field, it was the only jumpable place out, and following Hans. And he had enough guts to do that. And basically, the horse never looked back after that, and that's why you and I are talking now.
Amazing. And he took you to your first badminton win, which was 1973. You were only 22 when you won badminton for the first time.
I think I was a lot younger than that.
Oh, were you? My maths is wrong. My maths is wrong.
Yeah. Extraordinary, because we went to our first sort of novice event and it all felt very strange and different. But again, using what Dupy had taught me, because Befair was quite a shy horse. He was very, very intelligent, but he was careful and shy. I had to give him quite a few wallops, and that's where Dupy stood me in such good stead. And he graduated through novice, intermediate, and I fell off at my first intermediate, and I fell at my first advanced, which was at Wiley. First time either of us had ever had a horse fall, which was 100% my fault for coming up one of those steep Wiley hills and not doing anything about gathering him up before the fence on top. I wrote books about our journey because every single thing we did was such a huge lesson. And then he got me to badminton when I was 19, and he would have won that if I'd known not to wear leather gloves. And yet another thing learned at the expense of a run out at Tom Smith's walls. I pulled on the rein, and he just continued straight past the second one because he never felt it, because the sweaty neck made the leather very, very inadequate at holding the rein. He came fifth even with that run out. So he's rather extraordinary. He just had the most incredible depth of trust in me, and I had the most incredible depth of trust in him. And I honestly do think it was like a marriage, a really, really good marriage from a very young age. We just totally and utterly trusted each other, even though it had been a rough journey at the beginning. And he took me really from Pony Club to Olympic Games in 1976 in Montreal, and would have won a silver medal had he not slipped. Well, I say he would have won. He still had to get around the show jumping the next day, but he was in that position at the end of the cross country. Slipped the Achilles tendon off his hock as he turned for the finish. And I had no idea what had happened. He was just standing at the finish, kicking and kicking and kicking, and I thought he was having a heart attack. I didn't know what was going on. And I see that same injury occasionally now, and as soon as I see those horses kick, I know why they're kicking, because they've lost the Achilles tendon, and it feels strange, and they're frightened. And he recovered. He recovered enough to go home and to hunt, but he was never really sound again. He was a foreshortened hind leg, if you like. But it was a rough year, 76, because Wide Awake had won badminton and died on the victory lap of honour, and still nobody knows why. So it was a bad time to then have one of those happen to you at the Olympic Games. But that was very much, as we know, very much the way of horses.
How did you come back from that, Lucinda? So those two shocking things in a year, and you weren't very old.
It was a tricky time, and I remember it very, very well because it was capped by my father being diagnosed with liver cancer, which means basically curtains. And he was a huge force of support, not so much of how to ride, but he was very, very good at management because he'd been taught in the cavalry. And whilst management had become ever more modern since his time, he had some very sound basics that he put across to me early. And then when I finally had my first girl groom, I didn't realize he did quite a lot with her too. So it was a terrible blow to know that he was going to be very ill for the next few months, and he surely was. And then we were sitting in London, and the telephone went, and it was Elaine Straker, who owned an extraordinary horse called George, who had competed with her son Matthew and her son Nick in quite a high level for quite a long time. But they were in the army, and they came and rode him and then went away again and came and rode him. And I just happened to have seen him twice, but he had a record of falling 5 times consecutive times in the last fence, including Badminton. And I'd seen the Badminton one, I'd seen one at Brigstock, and there were 3 others. So I said, well, it's really, really kind of you, thank you. Let me just talk to my mum and dad about it. And they, with one accord, they knew exactly the horse it was. They knew exactly that he hadn't a great record. They just said, you must ride him. And I never forget that, because most parents would have said, oh, you can't ride that. But they knew that I had to get my mind on something else and not on Dad and all the things that had gone wrong. And so they were right behind it. And the preceding, that was in the sort of probably December, the preceding August, a month after I'd come back, or maybe even less, come back from Montreal with a still Be Fair intact, but only just. I had a strange telephone call saying, will you ride my horse at Burghley? And I said, well, what is the horse? And the gentleman said, I can't tell you that. I haven't told my rider that I'm not going to have her ride him anymore. So I thought, oh my God, this is the very position that I do not ever want to be in, which is not being able to talk to the rider before you take on a horse, because it's sort of polite and kind to do that. And anyhow, I talked and eventually got out of him that the horse had been to Punchestown that spring and he'd fallen. So I said, this horse is, I think I know what this horse is called. It's called Kildare, isn't he? He said, how do you know that? I said, because I was at Punchestown and I remember watching it. And he said, well, yes, it is, but you're absolutely not to tell his rider because it's very difficult and all that. And then I went to walk the course at Dauncey that afternoon, and God almighty if I didn't bump straight into her. And so for the first time in my life, I had to just pretend I didn't know anything about it and just said, how are you? How's Kildare? It was awful. I felt so bad about it. I've never forgotten it. Anyhow, he brought the horse down 3 weeks before Burghley. It was fat like a broodmare. And Dad and I looked at it and we said, well, we've got nothing to lose. You know, we've got no other horses to ride. And we said to Mr. Sizer, we'll try and get him fit enough. And off we went. And it was really quite scary jumping in because he didn't appear to jump. He just went down to Toby Balding's hurdles at the rate of knots, but never got anywhere because his stride was so short. But everything happened, boom-de-boom-de-boom-de-boom, and he got to the hurdle and nothing changed. His legs just stayed up in the air for a bit. And then he was to the other side and boom-de-boom-de-boom on. He scampered along like a mouse. And he didn't really jump. He just lifted his legs up. So we sort of thought, oh my God, you know, this horse cannot get round Burghley. He doesn't even jump. He just sort of has a way of getting from one side to the other. But anyhow, 3 weeks later, we arrived at Burghley. He didn't know how to do an extended trot. And David Hunt was helping me. And he took the boards out the corner of the practice arena. And he said, right, just keep trotting. Keep going until you get something, you know, all the way across the field. Anyhow, he went round Burghley. He just did exactly what I've described over every fence. He just sort of lifted his legs up and then eventually landed the other side and scampered off. And he wouldn't be told to slow down at any fence. He just scampered into the capabilities cutting, which is a complete, you can't see the landing at all. You need to go in slowly. He scampered in, popped over, popped down the bank, up the other side, and away he went. Everything was a scamper. and there wasn't a lot I could do about it. And he jolly well came second. And I'd had him 3 weeks, and he was as fat as a pig 3 weeks earlier. So it was actually a miracle for all the horrible things that had happened in the preceding 3 months. This was a real turn of the tide. And then I had those 2 horses to ride at Badminton, and George came to me 3 weeks before Badminton, his owner Elaine having really not wanted him to ever not be with her, so she got him fit and sent him down, and the blacksmith promptly pricked him, and so he was off a week. So I had 2 weeks, and then he went to Badminton, Kildare went to Badminton, and all sorts of things happened around there, but long story short, they were first and third, which was the most extraordinary thing, because the little Kildare was just so not cut out to be anything but a nice hunter. But he just had the biggest heart, and he was first, second, and third at Badminton in his lifetime. And I don't think that record has ever been equalled. And if you asked me which of my horses was the least likely to win Badminton, every time it would be Kildare, and he was the one that was first, second, and third. Extraordinary.
And what was George like? How did you build a partnership with a horse that had a record like that had fallen so many times?
Well, it had a huge amount to do with Elaine, because true to form, he went round the steeplechase at Badminton, which you have to do quite fast, and he just didn't bother to back off the open ditch, and he took the guardrail across the fence. I remember as I came round for the second time, it was diagonally across the fence. It was supposed to be in front of the open ditch. And I thought, oh, shoot, this is never going to work. I'd just come from a round with Kildare, who'd been the first horse in the world ever to jump a bounce into water, because Frank Weldon had designed a bounce into the lake, and nobody had ever done that before. And nobody knew there was one, so nobody practiced it. And there were little pink life belts on both elements, and they were 14 foot apart, which nowadays would probably be 12. But in those days, nobody knew what the bounce into water should be. And Kildare came down to that. And I knew that everybody was waiting in the rider's tent to see if it was possible. I knew there were 1,000 people around the lake waiting to see the splash. And I shall never forget it. And he scampered in the way he always did. You didn't tell him what to do. And he jumped the first rail. He put in a little scampery stride, and he jumped the next rail. But I knew that George couldn't do that. George was what I would term a normal horse. He didn't have the scamper. So I just couldn't see how he couldn't possibly fall. He had to fall. And in the box, I couldn't go the long way, because the long way was just stupid long. And I just said to Elaine, as we were sort of preparing to get on after he'd been washed down after the roads and tracks and steeplechase, I just said, I don't think he can do that bounce. I don't think I can ask him to do that. I think I've got to find another way. And she just looked at me and said, Lucinda, he's hunted all his life. He will look after you. He will jump that. And I thought, right, it's going to be on your head. I didn't say this, but I thought it took the pressure clean off me. And as I came into it on him, I thought, this is entirely in Elaine's basket. She told me he'll look after me. I'm having to believe her, because I don't know what the alternative is. And he did. And he jumped it absolutely beautifully, and he won the whole flipping thing. It was just remarkable once the fences didn't give like they did on the steeplechase course.
You took George to Burghley for the Europeans, Lucinda, after that, and that was a particularly emotional weekend.
It was a very, very difficult weekend, because Dad had died about 2 weeks before, having been incredibly ill, as you are with this wretched disease. And during the time that he was really, really ill, I'd gone on a fast, and I'd stopped eating in sympathy, and I ate cheese and apples, and that was all. And I had lost a lot of weight and was very, very weak. And George was quite strong. He was he was a German thoroughbred, actually, but you might think, if you looked at him now, that he was almost a New Zealand thoroughbred. He was quite a heavy horse, and he meant to only be 11 or 12, but I always swear he was about 4 years old. He felt an old horse. And he went round the steeplechase at Burghley up on the golf course. And I've had this trouble before. I think twice I've made this mistake at Burghley. It's quite embarrassing, really. And I went down the wrong roped channel. I went down the finished rope channel when I should have gone down the second circuit rope channel. And as I realised what I'd done, there was absolutely no stopping and turning back, because you just couldn't stop when you're going at 690 metres a minute. So I did the only thing that was left for me to do, which was pull him across the strings to get back into the channel I needed to be on to do the second circuit. So, of course, he stumbled incredibly, as you would expect, at full gallop. And I fell off in the middle of the steeplechase phase, and I hung on to the rein for all I was worth. He didn't even notice I was there. He just kept on galloping with me skidding along on my bottom. Eventually I screamed, "Whoa, George, whoa." And he's, "Oh, so sorry, you down there, didn't notice." And he pulled himself up, and then I had to get on him, which was a nightmare because I was feeling so weak, but somebody, I think, threw me on. And he came around that steeplechase course inside the time, despite that. And it wasn't wow, because I don't know how he did that. And then he went down the whole of phase C, a bit pooped, I think, and I was completely pooped. And I got into the start box, and Richard Mead was our team captain, came to sort of give me some last minute advice, but couldn't find me because I'd locked myself in the loo, because I didn't want to speak to anybody. I just hadn't got the strength to open my mouth. And yeah, as I came out of the loo with a lot of banging on the door, and you've got to get on, you're starting in 2 minutes. He just looked at me and said, "Come on, girl, you can do this," or whatever, you know. And so off we went. And about 3/4 of the way round, I really was thinking, I just don't think I've got another quarter of this course in me. And there was a marvellous, it was quite late. I was last to go, and 5 in the evening, and a lot of people had gone home. And there was one wonderful man in tweed +4s, and he raised his shooting stick. There was really no other spectators around him. He just said, "Come on, England, come on, George," really loudly. And I heard him, and it just gave me whatever I needed to somehow get him back into some sort of balance to jump. It was a Land Rover fence, but it was very different in those days, to jump the fence that was in that situation. And he did get me home. And then he had to jump clear in order to even think about getting what he was lined up to get. He was second at that point going into the show jumping, and a German called Karl Schulz, who didn't have a great show jumper in Madrigal, was lying first. So if I could go clear, that would put a lot of pressure on Madrigal. And I just knew that George was jumping everything he hit everything in the practice ring. He was just tired. He was an old horse and he was tired. And I stood there absolutely. Dad had died a week or two before, so obviously he wasn't around. And I stood at the entrance to the show jumping arena, clearly in a daze. Dick Stillwell came up to me. I just suddenly felt this almighty pain in my thigh, which was him pinching me, and said, "Come on, girl, get in there." And that did it, actually. He jumped the whole course. I don't think there was a fence he didn't hit, but not one of them came down. And Karl Schulz had his usual rather terrifyingly flat show jumping, because that was the way the horse was, very, very flashy dressage. But the flashy dressages very often in those days couldn't show jump. So George won the European, so he'd won Badminton and Burghley in the same year. And I was then asked if I would want to ride him again in the next year. And I said no, because I honestly don't think there's anything left. And he did come out again with another rider. But I saw him doing a hunter trials, and I thought, thank goodness I made that decision. And he didn't ever do anything else. He went hunting after that. But he'd given more than his all, that horse. And I just knew that there wasn't anything else left. And I've been incredibly
amazing
grateful.
Story. Yeah.
From obviously George and Claire went on to badminton, as you mentioned, in 1979. It was then in 1980, I guess, your second Olympics experience, which was a slightly different one because it was the boycotted games. And so it was sort of an alternative Olympics in Fontainebleau, where you had a humongous rise up after the first phase and then ended up with a top 10 finish on Village Gossip.
Yeah, he was a remarkable horse. He didn't feature as one of the 6 badminton winners because I couldn't work out how to ride his dressage, but he was second, I think, 7 major international events. He was a runner-up, and eventually, age 15, I worked out that if I just kept my hands still and didn't try and pull him on the bit, he would sort of vaguely go on the bit, and did a test that actually beat Bruce Davidson and Mike Tango, who'd won the World Championships in 78. and did win Punchestown, age 15. But up until then, he'd been second in many, many really good events. And he was a very interesting horse to ride because it was a bit like Hilaire in that you couldn't tell him what to do. You couldn't slow him down. But with Rocket Boost, I mean, he was incredibly fast. He was a minute inside the time at Badminton. And all was fine. It didn't matter that he was so fast because he was brilliant. And he would always throw in a little stride and check what he was doing. And he never took a chance, but he never slowed down until he got within a few strides of the fence. And then he'd just go bum, 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 and spring over. And it took me a year to learn that this horse, you could not slow down. And he stopped quite a lot with me the first year that I had him. And he'd been around Burghley as a 6-year-old with a wonderful girl called Katie O'Hara, who worked for the Brookburys of Northern Ireland. And he'd had a very checkered background as a horse. He came out of his mother vicious, and he would go for the people that tried to feed him as a foal. He was then bought by somebody who was learning to ride and went hunting on him. So his mouth vanished in that time because he was a very sensitive thoroughbred, and the double bridle and the person learning to ride swinging on his mouth gave that up. And then the Brook was bought in for a song because he was impossible and he wouldn't go forward, backwards, or any which way. And I mean, they have to do all sorts of things that aren't in the manual of horsemanship to just get him to move. And not whipping, because he doesn't make a damn bit of difference whipping. You had to do all sorts of things to get him to just go forwards. And eventually he, with Katie, went to Burghley, did this fantastic round, and was bought by a very, very kind sponsor who was Ted and Liz Edgar's sponsor from Everest Double Glazing, David Kingsley. And he bought him, and here we are going up the ladder now. We're paying £6,000 for a horse that's been around Burghley. And I felt this terrible pressure because he'd been bought for me by the company that was sponsoring me, and I was the first person to get sponsorship. And here was Village Gossip that was meant to be their flagship bearer, and I couldn't ride him. He stopped with me. And there was one day, I remember it right now, where I was hacking, and I just was in floods of tears because I just didn't know what to do. And I thought, right, you're going to an advanced event at Rushall on Saturday. You're just going to drop the ranging and let him go as fast as he flipping well wants. This was me talking to me. This was nobody else's idea, because nobody would have been stupid enough to say that. And I did it, and he won it. And it never, ever, ever looked back. And I learned from him that sometimes there are horses that you don't tell anything to. You do everything with your body and nothing with your hands. And the pace doesn't appear to slow up as you come to a coffin. You just stay sitting and you just wait for them to put their own little bum in. And therefore, because he did this way, he got incredible times across country. But it did come back to bite us at the 1978 World Championships in Lexington, which were under something like 95% humidity. And everybody was trying to go slowly, and the team that won in the end was Canada, because they put in 4 slow, clear rounds. And there was no question of being able to regulate Village Gossip. So he went round the steeplechase course in his usual lightning speed, about 15 seconds inside, went round the cross country at the same speed, and the first time in his life the corks came out, and he got 3/4 of the way around, and he fell over a fence into some water. And he'd never in his life fallen, because he'd never ever been tired. And that was really, we both emerged from that, it was called the Serpent, from that very chalky, dirty water in a totally different color. He was sort of cream and I was sandy colored. And of course you had to get on and finish because you were first to go for the team. And he did actually go quite slowly from then to the finish, first time I've ever known it, because he was really, really tired. And it was then that I learnt really that eventing isn't a team sport. It's an individual sport, because I wanted to stop and I couldn't. And my chef d'équipe didn't even recognize me as I came through the finish. He thought I was the Argentinian who was actually the first to go and hadn't made it to the finish. And we were so different in color that he didn't realize who we were. But anyhow, we didn't have to show jump the next day, mercifully, because the team had been well sort of beaten up. He wasn't anywhere in the reckonings. And interestingly, his heart rate, which a normal horse's heart rate at rest is 40, and his heart rate had always been unbelievably slow, 20, which I think is why he was such a dynamo of a horse. And after that experience, his heart rate came to the same as other horses. He was then 40 for the rest of his life. And for the whole of the next year, he was still not great. And I retired him from badminton. And then the year after that, he came back exactly as he had been. So we were very, very lucky, because that damaged quite a lot of horses, that experience going in that 95% humidity. But he was the horse that came, where did he come? You were asking me about him. Wasn't Burley, was it?
Seventh at the Fontainebleau Olympics.
Fontainebleau, I was trying to think, he didn't go to Olympics, what I'm talking, he was at Fontainebleau. And that classically has two huge memories for me, and I'll make them very quick. He was really, between us, we couldn't do dressage. We had Ernst Backinger from the Spanish riding school helping our team. And just before I went in, I suddenly got a panic. And I said, Ernst, is it 4 rein-back steps or is it 5 in the test? And he just looked at me and shook his head in a very dry Austrian way, just said, it doesn't really matter, does it? I was fun. It was probably the best he could have said, because it made me laugh, despite being about to do dressage test. And then he went roaring into the second fence on the cross country, which was called Napoleon's Hat, which was a conical mound about 30 feet high, maybe 40 feet high, maybe 20 yards up there over a log on the top, not very big, second fence, and down the Napoleon's Hat the other side. And he went storming up there, and I can't slow him down. I have to just wait for him to do what he does. And he said, oh, that looks pretty small, and stood off a mile, which he never used to do. And of course, he never came down. It was flying through the air for ages. And I thought, this is it. We're finally going to have a fall. And he didn't, bless him. And that was 2 years after Lexington. He was in such good form again by then. And he actually did somehow land nearly at the foot of the damn cone of the bank. And he went on and did a brilliant, brilliant run. He moved up from, I think, second bottom to seventh. He was an extraordinary horse. He taught me a huge amount about extraordinary horses. And I think he's been one of the reasons I find teaching so fascinating, because every now and again you see a horse a little bit like him, but they've never been quite like him.
And he played a part in you learning how to get the best out of Regal Realm, I think, who was your world champion.
Yes, Regal Realm was an amazing horse. He had a brain that I could understand. I never did understand Village Gossips, really. It was a very good brain, thank goodness. Regal Realm had a difficult conformation. His neck came out the bottom of his chest and went straight upwards. So I was permanently with his ears in my mouth, because he pulled, he was keen, he was a thoroughbred. And I did find myself gobbling his ears a lot, which made dressage incredibly difficult. But I had learnt so much about leaving a horse alone, but helping him still be in balance, that riding Regal Realm, I think, wouldn't have been possible without Village Gossip, but he was so much easier than Village Gossip. But the same sort of tactics applied to him, and he was utterly brilliant and very, very fast, and show jumped extremely well. And dressage was after a year or two was sort of bearable, whereas Gossips was unbearable. But he used to get quite good marks, because I think in those days, and probably it still happens, you used to get an extra 10 before you got past X, because you were a rider with a name, and that I relied on quite a lot with him. I got some good marks, and then I went to the Olympic Games in Los Angeles, hot favourite to win, everybody's bet apparently, and Anton Buehler, who was a Swiss dressage judge, who was always extremely tough, because he was a good judge. And anyhow, my mark came out exactly as it should have done, which it hadn't done for the preceding 2 or 3 years, which put him right down the list. And he ended up, I think, 5th. And people said, oh, you must be so disappointed that you didn't win. And I said, you know something? I am so thrilled. He did every single part of that games as well as he possibly could. Every single fence, every single movement. There were just 5 or 4 others better on the day. And that was exactly how I felt. But, you know, it was all the rage about him going to win the gold medal. I think he did win badminton the year after. I think my chronology is a bit bad, but I think he did come back and win that, which was wonderful. But he was probably had the people said he could have show jumped, even though he never bent his back once. I would think he had kissing spines. He always jumped with his head right up. He never ever basculed. But he had scope in that rather interesting kangaroo fashion. And people that know about these things, which I don't, said he could have been a show jumper or an event horse. So he's probably the most talented horse I rode, but he really did find dressage hard because of his conformation.
One more badminton winner, Beagle Bay. But I'd love to move on and talk slightly about your kind of the rest of your life and your career. You've did a huge amount of journalism for the Telegraph and for Horse and Hound, riding all sorts of really famous horses, which must have been quite fun.
I had the best time. I had about 18 years with the most wonderful editor of sport called David Welsh from the Telegraph. He developed the what became a daily sports pull-out. So that needed filling. And he used to dispatch me to go and ride racehorses, which was quite scary because I didn't know how to ride a racehorse. And the very first one he sent me off to do was Desert Orchid. And he was something else. And he was quite an ordinary, he had a slightly round front to his face. He wasn't the most elegant, beautiful horse. He was a really lovely steeplechase type, white. And he didn't really particularly stop when you asked him to. And he came off the end of the little gallop that he was on, and he just kept cantering. He wasn't going very fast, but he just kept going. I never managed to stop him. But that was a wonderful entry into, that was my first article for the Telegraph. And I was lucky because nobody really done it before. They'd never really written about the horses. They'd written about the jockeys and the trainers and everything else. And obviously they got a look in. But what I loved doing was writing about the horses and how they felt and their temperaments. And I did find it quite scary because quite a lot of these horses were quite strong. And there were two sorts of trainers I discovered. There was the sort of trainer that really didn't want me on them, but was doing it to get a bit of publicity. And there was the sort of trainer that thought I must be absolutely brilliant because I'd won badminton. And the first sort was the one that knew perfectly well I didn't know how to ride a racehorse. The second sort probably learnt by the time it was too late. But anyhow, I don't remember damaging any of them, but there was one in Ireland who went up the gallops at a sort of 45-degree angle because his head was, the only way you could control him was he could put his head there, because it's obviously how he'd been controlled, was to have his head at a 45-degree angle to his body, which is an awful thing for a horse to have to do. And in the end, it's going to lame him because he's not level on his front legs with his head 45-degree angle away. And he was called Sound Man. And he was very, very fast 2-miler. Anyhow, he went pretty fast with me too, but we did manage. He did know to stop at the end, so that was good. But there was another really brilliant horse that won a champion chase. And I think John Hales owned him, and he was trained in Cumbria. And he was called One Man. Yeah, stunning. And that was the one I would have loved to have taken eventing. Out of all the horses I rode, and I rode some unbelievably wonderful thoroughbreds in 18 years. One Man was my pick, and he was about 15.3. That's probably why I like them small. And then the what I did for the Horse and Hound was great fun because that was a few show jumpers. That was a champion cob of the year for Jane Webber Ross, Nick Skelton's, I think, was it Arco? I can't remember what it was. The worst of all of them was dear Laura's, Bechtel-Simers, Mr. Horse, the chestnut dressage horse that took her to London.
Yeah.
I could not even get him anywhere near the bit, not just on it, nowhere near. And dear Laura is such a super girl, and she was sort of saying, do this, do that, and absolutely nothing flipping well happened. And then I was meant to do Piaf and Passage and all these things that he did, but I mean, there was just button pressing. I had no connection with him at all, and I thought that's why I can't do dressage. That is just, we've just seen it in full glory. So there were some wonderful experiences. I think the champion cob was one of the best. I just loved riding him. He was hysterical, and we had so much fun.
Is it following on from sort of some of the highlights of your eventing career, and has been a real passion of yours has been teaching? Tell us a bit about that, because it's something that you're extremely well known for. You do all over the world, and something that you're remarkably good at as well.
Well, I've been very lucky with that too, because you never think you can teach. And when I was at school, my dad was a very good teacher, and he taught me very well tennis at home. And we were having a go at school in the summer in a games lesson at helping each other. And Miss Waller must have been listening to me teaching this friend of mine, because we all were in pairs. And then she looked at me and she said, "You've got a vocation, you know." I said, "What does that mean?" And she told me what vocation meant. She said, "You can really teach." And I was probably about 14 or 15. And I never thought anything of it, but I never forgot it, mostly because I didn't know what vocation meant. And then at about 23, 24, Peter Gray was a friend of mine from Bermuda who based himself in Canada, and he was at several Olympic Games, and he rang up and he said, "Would you come and teach? I want to do something to return Canada the favour for looking after me." And I said, "If you find me £1,000 a day, yes." And that was a lot of money in those days, but I thought, I really don't want to do this, but I'll put a crazy price on it. And of course he said yes, but I didn't put any outline as to how many people I'd teach. So I started at 7 a.m. 36 people later, 9 at night, I finished. And this was my first experience ever of teaching. And I didn't know how to get people's names. I called them green shirt, blue shirt, red shirt. I've never forgotten it, ever. And in one of those classes was a guy called Arthur Tateshi, who was half Japanese, half Canadian, who was completely hysterical. I mean, he fell off like this, fell off like that, burst into laughter. Such a character. And he said, "You know, I'd like to organize a clinic for you somewhere else. Will you come back?" And that started him pimping me for about 15 years around America. And he didn't have any contacts in America, but he was a salesman. So he was my pimp. And he sort of organized for me these clinics in America, all of them at £1,000 a day. And I gradually began to, I suppose, get a bit better at it. You know, I found some names instead of green shirt and red shirt. And I got, let's have just a little bit of a limit on how many people, because really I'm no good to anybody after a certain amount. And gradually, and it really was trial and error, I sort of formed a way of teaching. And really what I was aiming at all the time was that they would feel safe and happy enough to enjoy cross country as much as I did, and that they would understand how a horse thought and ride it appropriately. Never forgetting Hugh Thomas, who's always been a great acquaintance of mine, but I've always been faintly frightened of him, which he'd laugh a lot if he heard. But I remember one day,
I mean, crikey.
Yeah, exactly. He was a very, very intelligent man. One day at Badminton, I said, "You know, Hugh, that quarry coming up at fence 5 or 6 or whatever, that's terribly early for a horse, because he still hasn't really got used to the whole thing of being at Badminton with all the crowds, and he's still not really thinking in the way that you need him to think to go into the quarry." He just looked at me in typical Hugh fashion and said, "How do you know what a horse is thinking?" And I just said, "I don't, but I just sort of do." And of course, I have no idea how you know, and you don't always get it right, but you do get a very good idea. And that was something I loved to put across to people who maybe were thinking that their horse was a motorbike a little bit. So that was the two things, really. I wanted people to be in a position whereby they didn't fall off, they didn't interfere with their horse's ability to jump, and therefore they could have much more fun than if they did fall off or did interfere with their horse, and that they would start to think through their horse's eyes and not just think through their own eyes. And I suppose that became, over the years, at the beginning, it was just a means of earning money, because, as you well know, there's not very many ways of earning money in horses. And then I suppose the older I got, the more of a interest it became, and the more of a passion it became. And it is something that I find extremely fulfilling. But my goodness, there are difficult times, and you never ever know all the answers. And I think that's probably what's so wonderful about it. You're leveled. You know, you know a lot, but you've done 10,000 hours or whatever it is, but there's still so much left to learn. And I often wonder how I ever rode with as much good fortune as I did, because I've learned more since I stopped riding at a high level regularly. I've learned way, way more teaching than I ever knew when I was riding. So it's been a huge journey of learning too, as well as teaching. Sometimes I say to the people in my class, I should be paying you for this. I've learned so much from this class. And it's true, you do. You learn a heck of a lot. It's wonderful.
And of course, you continue to compete yourself, and I'm sure will continue to do so. But your daughter rides at the top level. What's it like having a child competing and doing what you did in a very different era to you?
Well, it's absolutely amazing and fascinating, and I think I did try really hard to put her off because I knew where the life led. I've had the most amazing, incredibly exciting journey, and I don't think it's finished yet unless I go under a bus tomorrow. But I also knew that it led you to very little financial security and probably to pretty disastrous personal life because you're so single-mindedly with the horses. When my darling son told me he was going to marry the lovely Kiwi Lizzie Brown, who was a successful eventer over here for a time and then went back to New Zealand, he said, I think I'm going to marry her, Mum. I said, just watch out, Freddie, because she's an eventer. She's a horsey person. She will always put our horses before you. And he just looked at me and he shook his head and said, I know, Mum. So I think he'd had a pretty good upbringing to be able to cope with being married to an event rider because he'd actually had to deal with it not being horsey himself all his life. But where were we when I deviated into Freddie's talk? Lissa. Yes, I did try and put her off. I tried really hard because I didn't think it was a life that bore much fruit, and I absolutely didn't have the money, and it is an expensive game. And so poor girl, she got all these other people's lent horses that were, good for her because she learned to ride, but they did land her in a few ditches, and she was incredible. She got an Appaloosa around an intermediate at quite a big event, actually. I don't think it ever went again after that, but she just made it happen. And she had tremendous courage, but I still hope that she wouldn't do it. And as you know, if you don't want somebody to do something as a parent, they always do, don't they? So it became quite clear to me when she was sort of mid-20s that she'd sort of taken herself off and done other things. And I hoped that was it, but then sort of came back to it. And that's why she's a bit older than some of her peers, because she actually didn't get any encouragement from me at all for the first sort of half of her 20th decade. And then I realized that she had the bug, so I'd better get on and try and help her as best I could. So I increased the teaching. I went a lot further around the world for a lot longer and tried to help her. And she started to develop her own little band of owners through her Facebook. She's a very, very good communicator. She's had a lot of things go wrong. She had her best horse that went beautifully around badminton, then destroyed by fireworks just the week before Burghley. And 18 months later, we hoped we got him back, and he was third in an event in Portugal this March. But then by the time we got through this summer and we were hoping to go to Po, the injury that he'd sustained to his meniscus in his stifle, it came back, and there was arthritis, and the hind suspensory went in sympathy, and he was basically done for. And it was deeply disappointing because she sort of got him as a pretty failed horse, and he'd really done incredibly well. He'd been in Sweden with a gorgeous family, but he'd sort of a little bit walked all over the lovely girl that owned him, whom we adore and keep very much in touch with, and had gone to another more professional rider, and they'd done a bit with him, and then he got sold, and he was really quite bad at show jumping. He had 44 penalties in his first event with Lissa, and she and Dickie Waygood really got together and worked with him and produced a really, really good show jumping round out of him. He was always a very good cross-country horse, and the other tussle was a dressage, but it was coming. And so that is hard to get a horse to the top, but it's very, very devastating when they're taken away when you still have a few years left. Anyhow, that same fireworks did actually destroy a whole string of horses that we had sort of ready, 4 years old, 5 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old, sort of, the timeline of horses that we had ready, the whole lot. We didn't realize at the time, but they all produced injuries later on. that could be traced back to an injury from shooting away. So it was very, very, very sad. But that's life. Life is tough. Never meant to be easy. And she's building up again slowly, slowly. And some wonderful, wonderful owners have stuck with her. And money is not what we have, but she has a lot of graft and a lot of ability. And I love watching her ride because she's got more than I have. She's got that wonderful ability to understand horses. She's very, very quick to react. She's very, very brave, but she's got more feel than I had. She she's dad had a lot of feel, and she's got the best bits of both of us, really. So I just say, take your time. You can't do any of this in a hurry. If you love it as much as you appear to love it, you'll get your just reward, but she's going to have to be patient.
It will come. She came on the show earlier this year. We had a Lucinda Green Red Mills special, and it's actually one of my favourite shows of 2020. And we had so many people get in touch after it because her story is absolutely incredible. And we really, really hope that some good luck is coming her way in the next few years. Listeners,
what a
it's still
lovely
online.
thing to say. She was so
honestly,
embarrassed by that whole podcast. She came out and said, "I'm never going to do that again. I'm so embarrassed. I didn't know what to say."
She was honestly brilliant. Lucinda, she was amazing, absolutely.
Oh my God!
Amazing.
I wish here, and I actually, when we finish this, I might get you to say that to her in person because she's outside. Because she really doesn't have a lot of self-esteem. It's understandable. Really, me as a mother must be a bloody bad start, really. But she really did think she had done a bad job. So it's really lovely that you felt that, and I might grab you to say that to her when we finish.
Oh, I will with pleasure. And listeners, if you haven't heard it, go back and listen because it is unbelievably inspiring. And she puts it across beautifully. To talk about, but thank you so much. It's been an incredible career, and I think one of the things that shines through for me is they haven't always been the easiest of horses. It hasn't always been the easiest of journeys. You say luck, I say hard work, dedication, and a hell of a lot of talent. But it has been a real pleasure to go back and look at some of the highlights with you. So thank you.
Well, you do your research so well, and it's absolutely amazing. And you've even managed not to have me cry. So that probably would have been, you would have done it if we'd been on. Luckily, we're not on a screen.
Lucinda, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. And Catherine, thank you as always.
It's always a pleasure, and it's always a great pleasure to speak to Lucinda, who I've loved lots of stupid questions to over the years and had remarkably sensible responses. So thank you.
Great.
Listeners, we really hope that you've enjoyed the special Hall of Fame episodes. It has been a real treat to bring it to you, and we have much more coming up for you, so do stay tuned. But for now, a very, very big thank you for listening, and we will be back with another episode of the Echo Ratings Eventing podcast before you know it. Thank you for listening to the Echo Ratings Eventing podcast. This podcast is available for free on iTunes, Spotify, Podcast Addict, or wherever you usually listen to your podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. Find us at eventingpodcast.com or search Eventing Podcast on social media.